So this is chapter 6. It's our last chapter, and it deals with 2 points, sawdust spawn and plug spawn. And probably this is going to be a more complete course I talk. So let's start with the first point on how to make sawdust spawn and what are the differences between grain spawn and sawdust spawn. So during incubation, mycelium inoculated grain bags produce heat. This is why you should always place freshly inoculated grain bags several inches apart, one from another. During this process, also a huge amount of CO2 is released from your bags. You may feel this heat by touching the grain bags after 7 or 10 days after inoculation. Now, this isn't a good thing just because it increases the contamination risk and in some extreme cases could kill the mycelium. So this is way more pronounced when you're doing grain spawn, while it's not that pronounced when you're going to focus on sawdust spawn. Now, because cereal grain is so nutritious, it's very attracted to competitor organisms too. So this makes our work hard because keeping away those competitors, it's challenging. When you do sawdust spawn, the contamination rate drops just because sawdust isn't that nutritious. Unfortunately, sawdust spawn isn't a mycelium growth booster. So try to inoculate sawdust with sawdust spawn and you will understand what I mean. Also compare it to grain spawn inoculum. You will see a difference in substrate colonization time. Sawdust, it's a mass of wood granules of different sizes. So they're smaller than cereal grain and therefore they will provide more inoculation points when used as inoculum to a mushroom substrate recipe. When we use grain spawn as inoculum for mushroom substrate recipes, we may observe variations in mushroom fruit body yield. And this depends on the amount of inoculum that we would use. Now, when we're using sawdust spawn, this yield will be lower. In this case, to get a similar result, we could supplement a bit higher the substrate recipe. So these are pretty much the differences between the two types of spawn, and I guess you're going to make the right decision and you're going to pick one of them. I want to tell you that grain spawn, it's very common, and probably sawdust spawn, it's more likely used with some mushrooms in some farms. Now let's see how to make sawdust spawn. Making sawdust spawn, it's a little bit different than making grain spawn, and I want to show you what the differences are. So let's see what kind of sawdust we should pick for making sawdust spawn. First, you need to select your mushroom type. If you're going to use the spawn for growing some varieties of oyster mushrooms or reishi, and you have available conifer sawdust, then use it. Otherwise, use just hardwood sawdust like oak, poplar, alder, or some other kinds would work just fine. Also, for best results, try to match a fungus strain that was found growing on the same type of wood. This definitely is going to give you better results than compared to when you're getting your strain from some other locations, which is adapted to some other kind of habitats. Mix the sawdust with 2% gypsum. This is important because sawdust forms a compact mass compared to grain, and actually gypsum will form some porosity, which will help with gas exchange within the substrate. Now, you don't really need to add any lime to change pH unless you really want that. This because when we make sawdust, spawn has way lower contamination rate compared to when you would do that with grain. So the next step will be to hydrate the sawdust, which is done differently in this case. We simply add water to the substrate, but we need to be careful on how much water are you going to add to that. Using too much water will slow down mycelial growth and encourage bacterial formations, so we need to make sure that the substrate humidity rate will be somewhere between 50-65%. Typically this is done by eye. Just grab a handful of hydrated sawdust, squeeze it, and when you see 1 or 2 or 3 water drops dripping, then you'll know that you've got the right moisture content. Then autoclave or pressure cook the moist sawdust for 2 to 3 hours. Now remember, this forms a compact mass compared to grain, and because of this, somewhat more time is needed for proper heat penetration. To cool down, the substrate will take a bit longer than in the case of grain. When you're going to inoculate this, use grain spawn. This will be necessary just to boost mycelium colonization of your sawdust substrate. For inoculation, use about 2 to 5% grain spawn. Now the incubation is the same, just in the other case. Also here, make sure to shake bags or bottles 4 days after inoculation just to speed up the colonization time. Sawdust spawn works well with fungi like shimenji, namiko, king oysters, or reishi. I really recommend you to try it and use it, just if you consider that has more advantage for your operation. But as I told you, most growers, they just use grain spawn. They're using grain spawn just because I guess if they can control well the conditions and avoid contaminants, then they're going to get more yield